And we are live. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. We are here with the one and only Benjamin C. George, who has written an awesome book called No Absolutes. We have covered a lot of different areas of psychology and philosophy, and I've had some pretty good feedback on all our conversations. And we are just going to dive into it today. And I'm sure we're going to cover a lot of different areas from balance to language to all kinds of cool stuff. So thanks for joining us today. And Benjamin, how are you? What is there anything you want to start with before we dive headfirst into this pool of chaos?
I'm doing pretty well. Nothing that comes to the top of my head, so let's dive on in.
Fantastic. I wanted to start today with I was reading through some of your book and I found myself thinking about the concept of balance. And there's one part that I wrote that I highlighted in here that I want to read to you first, and then I got a question about it. So let me just start off with it here. It says, "It is a testament to the power of the concept of learned behavior. On the grandest scales, we observe change, a lack of absolutes, and a fluidity to existence. Yet through repetition and lack of exposure, we can lock ourselves into a seemingly finite box of existence with defined walls removed from the flow of reality." That's a big sentence right there. And I think I kind of grasp it, but can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. It's there's so many different things that are all in this massive, interwoven, interconnected thing that we call existence. And but we can choose to amplify certain signals above others. And when whether through just the nature of the information that you're taking in, or whether it be a direct conscious effort, when you we start to ingest certain types of information and limit ourselves in any which way, shape, or form, we can take this grand, seemingly infinite potentiality and put it into a tiny little perceptive box of these are the only possibilities and outcomes that could possibly happen with any choices that we can make in life.
Okay, that's a beautiful setup for what I want to go into. So when we think about putting ourselves in this box, I find myself coming to the idea of repetition. And it seems odd to me that in our society, so much of what we celebrate is an attempt to reach perfection by means of repetition. Like we are, sometimes I grew up on the maxim, repetition is the mother of skill.
Mhm.
Repetition is the mother of skill. I should say it. Repetition is the mother of skill. You just say it 3 times so it gets in people's heads, right? Especially if you look at any sort of professionals in the sports world. You got muscle memory. You have people in the academic world trying to remember pi to a certain decimal place. But this idea of perfection through repetition, it seems like a way of putting on blinders and stopping us from seeing the big picture. It seems like we're putting ourselves in a box. So why is it that we value repetition so much, and yet it seems to be something that narrows our focus?
Well, I would first approach it from a biology perspective.
Okay.
you know uh, our brains are this massive pattern recognition machine, always grabbing information, all the sensory data that we're inputting into it, and it's constantly reinforcing and looking for the patterns in that whole process. So from a biological perspective, if we're focused on food, for instance, then our imperative becomes how to gain food more efficiently. Recognizing the patterns of the game that we're hunting, recognizing the patterns in fish mating cycles if we're fishermen. Uh, and so, this kind of perception called focus, and that allows us to accomplish very specific and complex tasks while ignoring the rest of the world. And I think there's an evolutionary prerogative that kind of underpins that type of behavior and that ability. Um, you know, but when you look at it from different perspectives of, like how you're operating in society, for instance, you can have these very interesting aspects like sports and whatnot, but you can also have detrimental and, other positive aspects as well. And so, the question then becomes, well, where does one draw a line, and where do you want to be with your life, and how do you want to operate? What paths do you want to take? And, for me, that comes down to balance. Uh, we all want these novel experiences, and we've heard a lot of maxims, like it takes 10,000 hours to master a skill, practice makes perfect, you know many more of these things along the way. And they're very helpful if you are trying to master a skill, if you are
Yeah.
trying to go out and learn something new. Being able to put yourself in a field of focus, and you can accelerate the learning of those skills. I would say on average, it takes to be truly proficient in something about 2 years of dedicated focus, in my experience. And that dedicated focus isn't, 24-hour focus, but it's a daily focus. Um, and the daily part of it is very important. Uh, our bodies are under circadian rhythm. All of our processes are, the release of neurochemicals, how we interact with, this whole biology is all kind of tuned to that 24-hour cycle. And so when you start to implement something daily in that 24-hour cycle, this pattern recognition machine picks up on that and starts to attenuate, you know, different ideas, pathways, releases of chemicals at different times, etc., to facilitate that kind of that end result, whether it be focus or something more broad.
Yeah. So that brings me to the idea of change and how it works with balance. Like it
Hmm.
seems like, anytime there's too much change, and I've seen it in my life, and I know other people who have, when faced with change, sometimes it causes paralysis because you're so set in those patterns.
Hmm.
However, without change, like you'll never achieve that which you want to do, nor will you ever be able to see the goals that you want to do without change. So it's kind of a tricky relationship between change and balance. How do you manage that?
Well, I think that goes back to the title of the book, No Absolutes.
Right.
When the reason that change gets pretty tricky is because we get very attached to these, whatever they happen to be, these tribes, these ideas, these, behaviors, whether they're internal or external, doesn't matter. As soon as we get very attached to these things and they become our realities, and, you're viewing your world as this is my world without, any sort of wiggle room or whatnot. Now those attachments, the pattern recognition machine again, gets really just, it turns into a wall. And now you're essentially trying to kick down a wall inside when you want to change these patterns or these behaviors or what have you. And that's going to cause conflict. It's going to cause, because you've identified with this, because you've told some, people who you love and care about that this is exactly how the world is. Now you have to be like, well, I don't think the world's that anymore. You're like, are they ever going to take me seriously again? There's all these existential kind of psychological crises that happen with those types of things. And so when you have these affirmations that become absolute in your life, you run a much greater risk of running into these problems whenever you're trying to change and grow. However, if you have a bit more of an amorphous kind of view to things, no absolutes, where you're always ready for that new piece of evidence that will allow you to shift your focus without, that friction of change, then you have the ability to really, you know, grow and change without having that conflict at such a high level. Still happens. I mean, we naturally attach to things, so it's still going to happen. But those perspectives can help you navigate those waters, you know, at a much more efficient pace.
Yeah, that's well said. I often I've found in my life that change is such an internal thing. It's something that can be as easy as changing the words you use, or as easy as changing the thoughts you think, which are kind of similar in nature. But
Mhm.
those small changes in the way you use your words, or those small changes in the way you think about things, can have a radical impact on the way people perceive you. And it just comes from the perception about yourself. And I wanted to ask you this question on the topic of change. Do you think that radical change in your life comes, or can at least be helped by, different or alternate stages of consciousness? Like if you change your consciousness, will that allow you to see yourself and the world different?
I think all the change in my life, just quickly reflecting back on it,
Yeah.
you know, it's always driven from either an emotional perspective or a conscious perspective. It's either and usually a conjunction of both.
Mm,
It's I don't want this to be part of my life anymore, and I know that there has to be a change, so I'm going to do that change. Um, when I was 24, almost 25 years old, I spun a globe, landed in the ocean, and then it was like, well, I don't want to go to the ocean. And then I went across, and it ended up in Costa Rica. And I was left for a 6 year journey, which I had no idea how it was going to be 6 years, but it ended up going that long. Yeah, I had a point. I forgot what I was going to say. Damn. Sorry.
you're talking about the nature of change, and it was emotional,
Right.
or
Right.
or
So that was kind of like one of those physical moments where I was like, I just want an adventure in life. Um, and so that was the result of that. But a lot of the times, like especially as you live longer, you see more and more people pass on.
yeah.
And that's one of those things where it's really, usually a sock in the gut almost every time, especially if you have a good relationship with the person. And it's usually a nice little reflection in the mirror, being like, okay, well, what are you doing? I mean, there's only so much time here, right? So I think the you can get those radical changes in life from multiple different avenues. How you deal with those, I think, is important as well, because you can be caught up on these things, like the stages of depression and whatnot. Going, if you could process through that type of emotional stuff because you just have a different perspective, and you can utilize, the lessons from it, the memories, the metaphors that come from all of this, the way that we deal with the grief, and you can put that into a practical application and use. Now all of a sudden, you can enrich and empower yourself from these radical change moments, and not have to be as fearful of
Yeah. I once heard it said that there's two ways people change. One is through inspiration, and one is through
it.
desperation.
Hmm.
And it seems to me, when I look back on my life, those have been two of the main drivers that have allowed me to make what could have been conscious change, but started off as unconscious change. And I think, as you said, as you get older in life, like, you have these two twin hammers of you know of inspiration and desperation. But as you get older, they don't have to be such up and down. You can start to do in the middle of the road. You can begin to see, instead of having violent swings up and down, you can see the inspiration, you can see the desperation. You can mitigate those by, duck diving the wave or swimming over the crest of it. And I think that's a big part of learning who you are and what you're capable of. And I think that brings us back to balance. I think that in the beginning, no one none but the most gifted among us understand what balance is until you've lost your balance in life. And that comes from losing loved ones. That comes from giant things that happen on some idle Tuesday that you never thought of before.
Hmm.
But once
Well,
you go through them, you're able to become better at walking that tightrope.
absolutely. And tying it back to our first conversation we had, one of the first things you asked me is that, does there need to be some sort of suffering to foment some
Yeah.
type of change? And this kind of goes back to that. And it's not necessarily suffering, but if you don't have those perspectives, those understandings of, the loss and, how to deal with these things, then you might make some sort of change, but that change is going to be, in the future, that boat's going to get rocked again, unless it's a balanced change. And, so while it does take suffering to do this a lot, you do have the other side of that, inspiration, where now, hopefully through conversations like this and projects that people are working on in the world, we can have these inspirational things that allow us to grow without the suffering. And, that's kind of one of my hopes by, sitting in front of a camera and with a light in front of my head.
Absolutely. Sometimes when I talk to people, I'm really fascinated by the stories they tell themselves, like to help them see the world and get through life. Can you share like what is it that goes on in your mind? Like how let me start by an example. Like let me tell you how I see it that helps me, and then maybe you can share your ideas, your kind of your worldview and your narrative. For me, lately I've been seeing the world as whatever I manifest or whatever questions I ask myself, I see the answers begin to form in nature for me. And it's almost like a dance sometimes. Like, I'll give you an example. I'm super stoked on this podcast and my YouTube channel. In the last like 28 days, I've seen my channel views go from like something like 20,000 to 2.5 million. And it's not my podcast. I wish it was our exact conversation that was getting that many views. But that's
Hmm.
not the goal I had set. The goal I had set was like, look, I want to start getting millions of views. And it's almost like a dance. It's like I'm dancing with this beautiful woman called nature. And I'm not quite sure how it's going to happen, but it's happening. And the fact that it didn't go exactly like I wanted, it makes me laugh because it's so beautiful. Like maybe it's not supposed to go exactly the way I wanted it, but look, here's the results. It's coming the way it's coming. That's what you wanted. And it's almost like when you can see yourself as not in control of everything, but as a way of moving through everything or moving lockstep with everything. You may not end up exactly where you want to go, but you're definitely in that direction. And I think if people could see that way, at least that's the way I see it. Like what you project inside is possible, can be possible. You, you may not the vehicle you use may not be the one like you exactly thought of, but the vehicle will get you there. And so that's like one of the frameworks I've been learning, and it's helped change me. It's helped me
Hmm.
see things better without the necessities for absolute. It has to be absolutely this way. No, it just has to be that. You just have to get to that destination. So that's
Hmm.
kind of one of the frameworks I've been using. What are some of the frameworks that you use when you find yourself moving through life?
Well, to what you said, I would say, I would step back to last week, and words are important.
Yes.
And defining that intent. Well, your intent was millions of views. It wasn't millions of views on these specific podcasts.
Yeah. That's true.
um so and it is a funny dance, and this has been my observations over the past 15 some years, is that in lots of anecdotal evidence and conversation with people who've had similar observations, is that this is kind of how that dance works. Is and then the more you are attenuated with that dance, the more you're aware of everything that's happening, the more you're able to kind of weave through and sway and flow with that dance. And the more you learn the nuances of the dance, right? Um,
Yeah.
but to answer your question, uh, my primary worldview is looking at everything as a series of systems.
Okay.
And all of these systems have an interplay to them, and those mechanisms of interplay, what affects what, how it affects what, when it affects what, why, etc., is kind of all like in a mental model for me. And so, it's kind of like you can see a string being plucked and then see the resulting effect, 17 steps down the line or whatever. Uh, yeah, I kind of developed that just from uh, tech stuff, just because I was so heavily involved in building systems and, websites, and then, full apps, and now a lot of automation and artificial intelligence stuff. Uh, it's just kind of like I would call it the programmer's mind. Everything has a loop that kind of goes through the entire system, and you make little adjustments to what that loop does when it goes through different parts of the system, and you get something on the output that changes that you're looking for. And so you're constantly kind of like playing that that game, if you will, to get the desired output. So that's kind of my default worldview with how I just kind of plug everything in. So,
Yeah.
but but to what you said is also how I've observed, everyday interactions and how people run their lives and themselves, how that translates to you know reality. So
Yeah.
yeah.
When you say when you spoke about the programmer's mind and you see yourself and you talk about the different loops and being able to change things, when you speak about that in your worldview, are you looking at it from a third person or are you submersed in it? Does that kind of make sense? Are you seeing it from like there it is right there, or are you like okay, I'm in this thing right now?
I more of there it is right there, from an outsider looking in. Um, you know, I always have kind of like a mental visual space where I can imagine things and walk around them. And I've
Mm,
always found that helpful in my life, for especially when it's more of a technical type problem. But then I learned how to translate that into other type of problems, and relating those same types of envisioning techniques in order to, you know, uh, basically put yourself in somebody else's shoes for like an emotional problem or something like that. Because it's the same idea. It's just, one, you have a defined like variable and you call it X. The other one is it's not really defined, but it's still a variable that you can call X. And you can do the same type of machinations and manipulations to get the idea of what's going on in any given situation. But that's just me. I'm a nerd. So
well, I would have to fit that same category in so many ways. You know, and you know what? Maybe you found this to be true, but you can spend a lot of time in those mental maps. I could spend a lot of time as X, but pretending I'm F or pretending I'm G, and it's easy to get stuck there. It's easy just to start thinking like, okay, well, Bob did this, but I'm different than Bob in these 5 ways. So how would those outcomes be? And the next thing you know, an hour and a half is gone by. As you've walked around the cube and saw all corners of
mhm,
it, and then put
mhm.
yourself in a position facing this way, and then this way, and then this way, you've the next thing you know, 2 hours are gone, and people are like, "Dude, what are you staring at?"
Indeed.
But I
And
think
this
it's
is
helpful.
Oh, I think it's fantastically helpful to be able to break it down in such a meticulous way. But then I think we also, after you do it for a while, you gain the ability of kind of intuition. And
Yeah.
so you'll be able to see it, and instead of walking around it, you almost get like a flash of everything around it real quick, and you take away the salient points, and then you have a pretty instant idea of what's going on. You can dissect it later, or sometimes you think you have that idea and you get stuck, and you can't figure it out, but then you wake up, and in the first 5 minutes the next morning you're like, oh yeah, I know how to solve that. And that's a wonderful aspect of this pattern recognition machine. It's trying to in the more that just like everything else, the more weights you lift, the more times you go out running, the more endurance you're going to get, the more strength you're going to get, the more times you work on problems that are, flexing different parts of the brain, and you get stuck on things, the more that the brain adjusts, and all of a sudden you wake up and it already found the answer. Whatever happened in that replaying of all of your sensory data throughout your sleep cycle, and in imprinting into your hippocampus and making memories and doing all of these little intricate things. Now you wake up and all of a sudden, hey, the idea is there. Did you come up with the idea? Well, You know, I mean, kind of, it's in there, right? But at the same time, you were consciously involved in putting that process together. That happens to me all the time. And in fact, so much to the point where now these days, if I get stuck on a programming problem, I won't bang my head against the wall. I just move on and go on with my day. And I wake up in the morning and try again. And it's a pretty nice method. Saves myself a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah, as I've in the last year or so, I have realized that on a lot of levels, it seems to me that it's not so much that you have discovered the problem as the solution has been revealed to you. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Like it seems to me like if you think about something long enough, I have found I try to use the language of it's not that I've solved it, it's that it was revealed to me. And it was revealed to me by maybe like you said, sometimes when you wake up in the morning, you have taken some time to think about other things and you have subconsciously found the solution to, you know, how to solve this problem by watching a waterfall. Or there's this and I really think there's a connection there. I really think there's a connection between thinking about a problem in your mind and then seeing something in nature. I think that the majority of problems can be resolved by observing that in nature. And I think that the relationship is there's because we're part of this planet, when you think of something, when you imagine something, when you take time to use your cognitive apparatus to think about things, it's revealed to you in nature. It's almost like there's a bigger power talking to you. Like the whole planet's a classroom, and you have a problem. Okay, I'm looking at this rose bush. Look at the way the flowers open up on every branch at like 47 degrees pointing towards the sun. There's some real geometry in there, you know. And if you just
mhm.
take some time to realize that you're not separate from everything else, the answer to the problem will be revealed to you. What do you think? Is that crazy?
No, I think there's a lot to be said about that. I would also, kind of segue on that is, the well of information that we're drawing from, to even envision what we classify as a problem
Mm,
is one in such that we've is the only exposure we have is nature, right?
yeah.
That's the greatest exposure we have to all this stuff. So, and uh, uh, there's plenty of times where, and we touched on this conversation a little bit of, when you have expertise versus, just a broad generalized knowledge and a passion for just learning in general. Well, when you have that expertise, and you're constantly just looking at a very narrow pathway, you might not go out and see the waterfall that gives you your answer, or the 47-degree tilt on the flower as the sun rises. You might miss these things that allow you to have these different perspectives. So a lot of there's a lot to be said about it, and it's been kind of replete throughout history by a lot of philosophers and thinkers and entrepreneurs and people like that. Is go out and do something hard, and then go out and be in nature,
Mm,
and go and then repeat that process as often as you can. And there is, there's a lot to be said about, just movement in general, and how that influences the human
yeah.
body. What sort of different neurochemicals get sent, when you start those movement processes, and how those facilitate thought and, focus and all of these different things. There's a great Are you familiar with Dr. Andrew Huberman?
I've heard his name, but please enlighten me.
He's a neuroscientist out of Stanford. He has a science-based podcast where he talks about all sorts of different things, neuroscience and in the biology in general, but how it relates to the neuroscience. All of the new papers, but then also breaks down, practical practical usages for those things, like breathing techniques, for instance, or
Mm,
what type, how these supplements should affect X, Y, and Z. Um, so, he's a fantastic tool to really kind of deep dive into stuff like that. If you haven't done that before, highly recommend.
yeah, I definitely will. I I, I think it's in I can't think of the exact word of it, but the yoga. I'm probably gonna butcher this, but oh, I'll just shoot for it. What the hell? I think it's in like the Yoga Sutras, the Vedanta tradition of like, if you think of yourself as a thought in the mind of God, like each
Mhm.
one of us is but a thought in the mind of God, and we are struggling to become an idea and then an action. And if you look at your life that way, I think it helps to understand the bigger picture. Like we're not here for that long. The same way that a passing thought goes through your mind, so too do you go through this life. However, if you focus on that which is important to you, and if you focus on that which fills your being, then you can turn this idle thought in the mind of God into an action. But eh, I think there's something beautiful about that because the more you become fulfilled in life, the more become fulfilled in creating a better world around you. And I really think there's a beautiful relationship correspondence there with, finding your destiny or, kind of bridges the free will gap. But it's an interesting way to look at life. And it's just a beautiful tradition, and it made me what you previously said made it tie into almost like a religious type of thought there. What's your take on that?
You know, as when I first wrote this book, it was about 4 years ago.
Right.
At that time, I had barely just scraped the surface in my anthropological studies. At that time you asked me this question, I would have a very different answer for you. But now, after spending the past 4 years, with a good deal of focus, looking at ancient traditions, different translations of ancient Sumerian texts, of the Vedic texts, looking at, ancient oral myths from indigenous tribes around the world.
Right.
Uh, all of a sudden, you start to see threads that, the only way they could be connected is if they're connected. you know, there's too many correlated, sometimes even down to names, where
Yeah.
it's like, and it's separated by, thousands and thousands of miles, and potentially, depending on, how you date things, thousands of years, or, even at the same time but thousands of miles away, when it's thousands of years before any of this should have ever been possible, type idea. And after looking at all of those things, and, the similar threads and pulling on them, there's nothing new under the sun. Is how I would answer your question. To be very vague.
I what it makes me like even the language about it. Like we have different hemispheres on the planet. We have different hemispheres of our brain. We have the left hemisphere, which is like this logical, analytical side, and we have this right hemisphere that is like this, more conceptual side that sees things differently. Same goes for the Eastern and Western cultures. It seems like we have this analytical side that's like, why? Like the Western is always asking why. And the right side has this concept of seeing balance in nature and learning from nature this way. I wonder sometimes. I wish I had the big map behind me because the idea of if you look at a map, there's all these trade routes on a map, and you have the ship
Mhm.
goes from here to here. And on the big maps, you can on a Rand McNally map, you can see all these lines crisscrossing the globe. It seems to me
Mhm.
that that's a lot like a human brain, and those are neural pathways. You know, if there's nothing new under the sun, and we can learn from nature, could we learn how to solve brain injuries by looking at trade routes on a map? If I wonder, maybe this is a question for Huberman, but it
Well,
seems if you look at it like that.
I would actually, the trade routes on a map is an interesting corollary to this. But they've grown, different types of mold in petri dishes, and the way that those molds grow, depending on, whatever obstructions they have in those dishes, are found to be more efficient than the algorithms we use to like sort data and things like this, than in our biggest, data centers and supercomputers. So yes, I would think that there's a lot to be learned from that type of observation. We're barely scratching the surface on how the brain works. You ask somebody how the brain works. If you ask 20 people, you'll probably get 20 different answers.
Yeah.
And you could even ask 20 experts, and you'd probably still get 20 different answers, just because we're that shallow of knowledge on how it all fits together. Uh, so I think there's a lot to be said about the potentiality of what we can do, just by moving a bit more back to nature from a pragmatic perspective of, hey, we're not the smartest thing under the sun. Most of this has probably already been done. How can we better mimic these systems to put ourselves in a better position from sustainability to long-term value, to back when I was growing up, it used to be pretty commonplace to hear that, the children inherit the earth.
Yeah.
You really don't hear that much anymore, which is kind of a scary plight. But moving back to the idea that we're a generational species, and a little bit probably less narcissistic from a societal perspective, I think is something that's going to be. I mean, it kind of already is an imperative, but I think we're quickly running up against that wall where instead of our inspirational change, we're going to reach a change of desperation.
Mm. Yeah, I think you can definitely see that happening now, and I I often wonder if so much of what we're seeing right now is because such a large population, like if you look at the population of the boomers on a generational scale, they're so large.
Hmm.
And I heard an interesting bit of information that said 10,000 baby boomers are retiring a day. And
Hmm.
if you look at it from a, if we pan back out and we look at it from almost a fractal point of view, such a large percentage of the human race is reaching an age where they are coming to their end of life stage. Like that's enough for the world to be in chaos. When any organism is achieving a state where part of it is dying, that creates chaos throughout the entire organism. If we look at us like that,
Hmm.
so many people are uncertain. So many people haven't made peace with death, and rightfully so. It's a huge thing. So many people are achieving this idea of I didn't make it, or I'm going to die, or I have cancer, or my kids don't like me, or I wasn't a good parent, or I am a great parent. But like just this aspect of us dying seems to me to be what you're talking about, desperation. Have you thought about it in those terms as far as generations?
Oh, yeah. Part of my thought exercises for how would you design a more sustainable type of system, uh,
Mm.
is how do you make something generational? And in that, goes into all of those things that you just brought up. Well, that fear of death, that end of life cycle, from what we have in today's current world, that they call it a burden on society, right? Because you have all of these things that are, old folks homes and all this stuff. Um, Whereas, talk about the greatest untapped resource that exists. Yeah, grandma's not going to sit in front of a classroom of 30 kids, but a grandma can sit in front of 6 kids and teach them, everything she knows about gardening in the course of a spring, right? There's all these things where just because it doesn't fit in with, protocols, regulations, permits, licenses, all this other crap, that you're not allowed to do it in society. You can't invite the neighbor's kids to come in your backyard today. Holy cow. You're just asking for somebody to call the cops one way or another. So when you remove the ability for us to utilize one of the most fantastic resources we have, which is somebody who's lived a whole lifetime of experience, regardless of, what sort of information is dated, it goes back to our conversation about that broad perspective of things. My grandma has informations on what her grandma taught them to use for salve, how to make different types of, remedies for different types of things that you won't find in any book. I mean, these are old recipes that were hundreds of years old, passed down through families that are gone, right? Because now all those people got put in old folks' homes because no one could afford to take care of them because of just the nature of everything and keeping up with the Joneses and yada yada yada. So, there's a dysfunction in how we operate, and wherever those dysfunctions are, especially at scale, they end up being these massive, massive drains on resources, across the board, really.
Man, that makes me think a lot. I never thought about it from that perspective, but maybe the message people should be taking away is that the people with the answers are rapidly leaving the planet, and we're not extracting the answers from them because you can't put a price tag on it. It's pretty
Right,
sad.
exactly. Yeah, well, and then, more so, there's not a price tag in going off and seeking those answers. Like, I'm not going to get
Oh
rewarded
yeah.
for doing so, right? Um, so you have just, and I've gone to quite a few retirement homes over the years, and those people want nothing more than to sit there and talk about their experiences, what they know, what they've seen, and you're just, all that data is just getting wiped out, and it's being replaced with people scrolling instead, right? I mean, it doesn't take rocket science to extrapolate where this goes after you fast forward for a generation or two. Not good places. So, yeah, it is there's very daunting problems in society, and all of the top down stuff that we've talked about prior to this hasn't been able to solve those problems, and now a lot of them are coming home to roost. Uh, you know, I don't know if you saw this one. Kind of a side note. The research about amyloidoid plaque and Alzheimer's turned out to be fictitious.
What? I didn't know that. Tell me about that. I didn't read that study. Are you
So
kidding me?
I just started reading this. It came out like yesterday. So definitely look it up and don't take it all to heart. But apparently some researchers went in and reviewed all of those studies about the amyloidoid plaque and its relation to Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that. And they found that it was, some data was falsified, some data just wasn't true, pictures were manipulated, all sorts of different things. So essentially fraud across the board. So what does that say? What do we know about Alzheimer's and dementia now? Fast forward 30 years, 20 some years of research down that very focused, narrow pathway of amyloidoid plaque. Now, the veracity of that, I'm not entirely sure yet. But I mean, even if it's 15, 20% true, I mean, that's a huge, you're talking billions of dollars of wasted research money, let alone the actual time investment, the machines, built dedicated to this, all this stuff. Wow. So, yeah.
Wow. I could totally see that. Like that goes a long way in explaining why there's been no progress, and it also goes a long way in explaining why it seems that modern medicine is moving towards a model of experimentation on people immediately. Like that would give you a reason why they're trying to speed that kind of stuff up. They're like,
Well,
Lord knows if you could just peel back the onion and that evidence was made public, like, hey, we don't know anything. Here is, 10,000 people a day dying of this stuff. We're better off experimenting. I'm not that that's a popular sentiment, but I wish the medical community would just be forthright with people and say, hey, here's what we have. Do people want to sign up for this? If you want to, you can. Here's these drugs that we have. And if you don't want to, that's fine. But I I don't see why we can't move towards a model like that. I guess liability is involved there, but maybe
yeah,
that's what's happening
exactly.
now. I don't know.
Well, I think all that comes down to liabilities, because now, it's all fine and dandy if Billy went and signed up and said he's okay with it, but then when Billy's mom says, Billy has a mental condition. He wasn't
Mhm,
capable of signing up for that. Now
mhm.
it turns into a big lawsuit. The litigious nature of Western society is an impediment on, towards many innovations, and sometimes rightfully so.
Yeah.
Um, Another one that's really interesting that, kind of blew me away is, all they found there's Brett Weinstein. Are you
Mhm.
familiar with him? Are you familiar with his mice research and the telomere research?
I'm familiar with telomere research, maybe not his particular type.
So, what he found is, they use these bred mice for all different sorts of laboratory testing, and that's how they
Mhm.
do all these FDA trials and things like this. Uh, he found that the laboratory mice that were bred in captivity had a completely different telomere degradation rate or something. I won't quote it. Definitely
Right.
something to look up. But the way that their telomeres were being, recorded in these trials were very, very, very different than what would a field mouse would be. So what this would kind of break down to is how harmful some sort of substance is to the cell. Because if it looked like there was more telomeres and the cell was able to reproduce with this, it's a greater amount of telomeres, it doesn't look like it's doing all that much damage to the cell. The cell looks healthy and it'll have a longer life. But if it just so happens that these, mice who their entire existence for generations has been breeding to see if they have longer telomeres, just so happen to have just naturally longer telomeres, then all of these trials that you're doing are very, they're biased. They're completely, they're not really related to what we would find in nature, which was kind of the idea behind those trials to begin with. And so that, and there's a lot more instances of that, and you have all those instances of that because of just the way that academia system is set up. You're only going to get funding if you're in a narrow band of what we're funding, and you're only going to get funding in that narrow band if what you're trying to research, says this is what we want to research, or
Yeah.
what contract we have to build a machine to, and those are kind of how all of this is set up. And then you have the gatekeepers of where the scientific papers get published. And so, it's we have, there's multiple imbalances to that system, but at the end of the day, the largest one is once you have all of that money filtered down those huge pathways, it takes a Herculean effort or a group of scientists many, many years to go off and try to reproduce those results. Some of the equipment in these things is, $1 billion equipment. How are you going to try to reproduce results from, if you don't have the $1 billion machine?
Yeah. And a lot of the times, like, you won't get funding unless you come up with the results they want. You know what I mean?
Right. The demonization of salt was all papers funded by the sugar industry.
Mm.
In fact, just recently, there's somebody got accused of funding a whole slew of climate papers.
Imagine that.
So yeah, imagine that. So it's yeah, so we have these imperfect systems, and then we've scaled them to hundreds of millions of participants, and then wherever there's a break in the system, there's also an opportunity to make money. And so you have this chessboard that's
Yeah.
very disproportional on, you know, what sort of actions, what sort of choices dictate real world responses, or how to change something, or how to fix these problems. And then oftentimes, because there's such concentrations of influence and resources and power these days, you know, you don't get too many opportunities to see those other paths, the paths less taken, which should be more taken, but here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I think you could break it down to, like, it seems that the problem we're having across the board is language. You know,
Right?
and maybe language is the fire that Prometheus stole and gave to us that we weren't ready to
Hmm.
have. Or maybe language is the ripe fig on the tree of knowledge that was plucked by Eve and given to us so that we know, quote unquote, good and evil, which we don't. But
Mhm.
language gives us this opportunity to explain things in a way that can make other people think, or better yet, feel a certain way. And it's
Mhm.
this idea of language that allows a credible scientist to get funding for a certain type of pill that is probably less effective than a placebo. You know,
Mhm.
I and on some ways, I think that if we can come to an understanding, if we can figure out a way to communicate more effectively with each other, then we can solve a lot of these problems. And you know,
Well,
that makes me want to shift gears here towards like, what do you think about using symbols?
mhm.
I gotta figure this out on the fly here. Maybe you can help me. Like, I think that we should be incorporating some sort of sim some enhanced symbology in our language. You know, and
Well,
let me try to unpack that a little bit. Go ahead, please. What do you got? What do you think about
well, I
that
was
so
going to
far?
say that's kind of emerging naturally.
Mm.
If you look at memes,
Oh, yeah.
you
Okay.
know, now a lot of them do have written stuff on them, but they're all instantly recognizable from their base symbology.
Mm.
And those symbologies transcend borders more than any other text. Even I would even argue these days, your biblical text.
Mm.
So, and then you also have your emojis and, all these little, identicons and all these things. So I would say that there is an emergent kind of symbolic culture that's kind of moving across the world. And then at the same time, I think there is a precedence towards moving towards English in general, and has been for a while. It's been, every all airline companies typically use English. It's been for the internet, it's been kind of the primary behind, all the regulatory bodies and things like this. And so I see a lot of English combining with these symbologies. And then, to the point where there are some things that I see out there that pop up, and it looks like English. It looks like it doesn't look like it's any other language, but it's all these acronyms and abbreviations and things that nobody used bother to use the period like I was taught you were supposed to. But so you do have this emergent idea of symbology that's kind of the internet age speak. Um, and tying into your point, about all the baby boomers retiring,
Yeah.
my my dad just had a seminar at his work, and they were talking about how the Generation Z is now going to be the number one incoming workforce,
Mhm.
even though despite how low they are, in terms of population numbers, just because of how big the baby boomer and the earlier Generation X was. So now they're talking about how to incorporate what these how these people interact with the world into these corporate practices, which is it's how do you get go from an office where you're talking with a boss in meetings to everybody's virtual and just doing it on a phone. That's kind of the transition that a lot of these companies are looking at. And
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I That is a fascinating change taking place. I think that let me start at the beginning of that one. I think that on the topic of memes and symbology, you know, it would be interesting to put together like a meme alphabet, and then you could put together like a meme. You know, you could put together different memes because I always think of a picture is worth a thousand words. So if you have a
Mhm.
meme, you know that you if every meme is like a story, it's like a if every picture is worth a thousand words, and maybe a meme is like a paragraph, you know, and if you put a couple of those memes together, you could really tell a story. And it harkens back to the idea that I think it was once said that a more perfect logos would be a language that can be seen instead of just heard. And if you can put those two things together, if you can hear something and see something, or if you can hear a picture, and in a way, it's kind of like a synesthesia. If you can, when you can hear a
Mhm.
picture, you can have a better understanding of what that person means. And that's why they're probably so funny sometimes. It's like oh, I get it, you can almost
I
hear
think,
it. It's so loud.
yeah, I think so. I think that's why there's such a prevalent, immersive kind of subculture. Like, it came out of nowhere, and to the point where people talk about people's meme games. I have no idea what that means personally because I'm I'm too old, I guess. But it's one of those things. When I heard it, I was like, okay, that's interesting. But the other part of this problem, because what you're trying to get to, I think, is you're trying to solve the larger problem, and in that education system to get that language becomes the where does that education come from, and how is that facilitated on a worldwide level? Because even if we decided today that the language was going to be this memology, and we
Mhm.
put together an alphabet, good for us. It doesn't really do anything, right? Unless everybody around the world adopts it. And in order to do that, they would have to forego all of these cultural, things. So it's an interesting thought experiment. But then the other additional thought experiment I would tie to it is, how does one get there?
Mhm.
Because I mean, if I agree with you that if all of a sudden, we could speak a language where, maybe it was, we had some memes or symbology attached to it, and everybody was able to speak that same language, the ability to articulate ideas, to paint a picture in somebody's head, to have somebody understand that, hey, it's not me against you, it's us against everything else. Having those ideas uh, being conveyed in a proper way would be fantastic. The practical step of getting there is, you know, it didn't work top down. It didn't work when everybody connected to the internet. So then what becomes the potential next step or next iteration to try and get that solution? And I think you approach it from the bottom up personally. But
Yeah, I often I think that's a big part of what's going on is the power structure, the ideas that we are confined in are no longer holding us. Especially like you said, like Generation Z, they're so much quicker and they have such a better understanding of the world they live in than the world we want them to live in. And I think that
mhm,
that's what's changing is from the bottom up. I see where I work, the next generation of leaders coming in, and
mhm,
they have seen their parents go through 2008 crisis, the crisis we're in now. They've
mhm,
seen them lose everything in the stock market. They've seen this world of business that is so just top heavy with haves and have nots that they're changing that. And
mhm.
there's no amount of maybe there is, but it seems to me that the incentive structure is not worth it for them, and that's why they're
Mhm.
dropping out of the workforce. Like, you want me to work 60, 80 hours a week for what? Nah, I don't think so. I think I ought to stay at home. And the people
Absolutely.
on top are like, "What are you talking? You have to come back to the office." And they're like, "What? Why? I'm just work from right here.
Yeah.
It's so much better." And I'm
Yeah.
so thankful for that because I think that is a better life for them, and I think it's a better life for society. And I think that they're building it. I think it's happening from the bottom up.
Well, I mean, and if you look at it, if you were to span out again and look back, it's been happening for the past 120 some years, ever since,
Yeah.
really kind of industrialization, unions
Yep.
kind of started coming into play. You know, it's just kind of the natural evolution. We went from having to, fight with bullets and baseball bats for weekends to,
It's
now
so
we
true.
to now now we're fighting with our words and our actions and our time for remote work and freedom of access and movement and these things. So but yeah, so I think that's been kind of a groundswell movement of Western society for the past 120 some years, really. And now we're just kind of seeing, you know, where does that end? And I think,
Mm,
you know, and it's coming to contention more so than it ever did. First it came to contention because capitalism was milk everything that you can. Then
yeah.
capitalism realized that, well, you can't do that with humans necessarily. You could try and you could get away with a lot of stuff, but eventually you have to give a little bit. And now the reality is, hey, there's a whole bunch of us. We're all on the same rock. What's the purpose? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? Now, instead of these, very local or regional things, there's a lot more questions about the world and worldwide things. And, you know, e- you know, how we are the largest threat to ourselves in many instances, where these systems are broken. And so, and then it's interesting that, a lot of these questions are then taken and then try to utilize for profit, like a climate change type thing.
Hmm.
Um, you can't go to a corporate VC thing and not hear ESG score, which is wild.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, I and a whole generation of things to the point where they want to assign you a personal carbon counter, which is I there's a lot to be said about things like that. And most of them, whenever it gets to the personal and assign, whenever those two words are put together, typically doesn't end well for the individual.
Yeah. It's both frightening and amusing, and to think about what's happening in the world of carbon capture.
Hmm.
And I'm sure it's a lot of other things besides those two things. I was talking to an indigenous American Indian. On the guy named I did an interview with him. His name is Dan Hawk, and he's just really
Hmm.
brilliant on a lot of different areas. And we were talking about this book. I quote this book way too much, but I was talking about this book called Black Elk Speaks. And in this book, Black Elk Speaks, he's telling the story about how the white men came to the indigenous people and said, "We want to buy your land." And he said, "We laughed at him. We're like, you can't buy the land. The land belongs to everybody, you dummy." And we laughed at
Hmm.
him, like, yeah, here, okay, give us your money. You can't buy the land. But no one was laughing when they rounded up Indians and put them on reservations.
Hmm.
And while it seems funny to us today about, oh, we want to buy the air, because that's essentially what giving you a score is. Like, we want to buy the air you breathe. And it's an
Hmm.
abstract idea, but it's not funny when you think how they said the same thing about the land and a
Right.
carbon being the most abundant thing out there. Like, it seems silly. Oh, you can't buy the air, but that's exactly what they're trying to do, is buy the very air you breathe. Like, it's
Well,
frightening to think that they might be able to do it.
to the tune that they've even estimated that they're going to be successful and that the value of all of this thing is in the hundreds of trillions of dollars by 2030 or something like that.
Yeah.
So, these types of things, it's a funny, like, oh, haha, that's cute. You can't own the air. And, but that was the same response, as you said, as the Native Americans who were like, haha, that's funny. You can't own the land.
Yeah.
But, the greater reality of that situation is sadly, might is right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times might these days is kind of an equation for money.
Mhm.
And those who control all of that, if they say jump, eventually you're going to say how high. Otherwise, you just don't jump anymore.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's the dangerous road that we're creeping down by, allowing central groups of authority to make decisions for the greater populace. There's great value in decentralizing power.
Yeah.
I think all of the great thinkers throughout history realized that in some way, shape, or form, that the decentralization of power, was greater for the common individual. Uh, for us to move away from that, we know where that road goes, and it doesn't end up in any situation that the common person wants to be in. Uh, so it's one of those things where, we are at a crossroads. We're at a precipice where, one way is right off the mountain, and the other way is to turn and find solutions, which they exist. The thing is you're not going to be able to take these solutions and enact them overnight, and more so, you're not going to be able to enact them and have every, you know, lapis luxury item of society today. Some of those things have to be, compromised at least for a time in order to invest in the proper, systems and mechanisms. We have 7 garbage patches in the world that, the size of these things is unfathomable in scale. We have all of these ecological disasters that are potentially impacting us, that has nothing to do with carbon and whatnot.
Yeah.
That's just another way to um, backbone the debt-based economy. If people are always in debt, then they can't own anything. If they can't own anything, then they have no kind of, point to rally around. Nothing, no sort of. You get the eventual removal of liberty, and then you have a whole bunch of cities where everybody is using the central digital bank currency that gets deposited in their account every 2 days, every 2 weeks, every month, what have you, and they get their that's on their state assigned cell phone, and they show up, and they do minimal tax, or they donate blood or whatnot, and you have these kind of dystopian city centers of the future where there's nobody who's going to exceed through these echelons. The cost of living in these places, you're only allowed to afford rent because it's subsidized type idea.
Mm,
uh, you know, and so that's where these economic policies take us whenever, they're trying to gain more and more ability to indebt you to that system. And, you can see what they've done with water resources around the world. I mean, Nestle is nefarious for what
yeah.
they've done. And, it used to be, yeah, I remember the joke back in late 80s, early 90s, there was a water fountain everywhere in every place you went, every mall, everything like that. And then somebody was selling bottled water, and they're like, who's going to buy that?
Yeah.
Well, here we are. You can't,
Yeah.
there's hardly a water fountain to be found, and you're paying a buck 99 for some Dicini.
Yeah, there was a great skit. I forgot who it was by, but they were talking about the French company Avion, and he's like,
Mhm.
"Oh, Pierre, I think we can sell the Americans water." And he's like, "No, they're not that dumb." And he's like, "Oh, no, you know." But yeah, it's amazing what a great marketing campaign with the right language directed to the right people can begin to do. I think it was Edward Bernays in his book Propaganda that said, "The
Mhm.
minds of the common man are molded by people whom you'll never know." And it's just an article placed here and a right picture
Mhm.
over there and the right shirt over here. And you can see it today with, if you go on LinkedIn and you look at job offers, you can see, you know, 30 to 100 a day for people in TikTok for marketing. And they're just, here's your talking points. We want 2 minutes of these talking points with these images. Go.
Mhm.
It's right
Yep.
there in front of you. That it's being done. And in a way, it's fascinating to think about how modern day propaganda is a form of, it's kind of sad, but it's almost like the highest art that we have is our propaganda these days, and you can look at campaigns like Obey or some of these other people who have gone out and changed the way you think by
Oh yeah.
showing us images of the way they want things to be. Let
Yeah.
me ask
I
you this.
mean, okay, go ahead.
Okay, like, do you see what's happening in Sri Lanka as something a that is pushback against the system that is happening because people went too far? And by they, I mean, like, the World Economic Forum, the Atlantic Council on Foreign Relations. Do you see the breakdown of society in Sri Lanka as something that is pushback, or that something that was orchestrated?
Well, simply because all the media is owned by a very small select group of people typically. It's very hard to make any sort of assessment if anything was
Yeah.
orchestrated or not. Um, I would say that there is evidence to support a consistent narrative of, you know, the policies that were adopted by the Sri Lankan government in cahoots with people like the World Economic Forums and the carbon capture agendas and things like that. Uh, and then the resulting policies, regardless of the kickbacks that were made, enabled this kind of reality that we're seeing now, where yields were so far down that it was basically the abolition of farmers in that country after just a couple years. Uh, so orchestrated, yeah, I think everything is orchestrated to at least a little degree this day and age,
Yeah.
simply because everything's paid for.
Yeah.
If we had a system that was based on barter and goodwill, I would say there's a lot less orchestration. But when you have everything that's based on dollars and barrels of oil, things become pretty orchestrated pretty quick, at least at some level.
Yeah. I often wonder, like it's my mind shifts back and forth between, oh gosh, I can see how this works, to this is just chaos and they're trying to control things. And it's maybe that's exactly, maybe it's a combination of those two things. Like there's people that have money who think they're in power and they have plan A, B, and C. And even
Well,
A,
sure.
B, and C aren't good enough because this whole thing's coming down and they need D, E, F, G.
Well, sure. I mean, if you look at just the nature and concentration of power, resources, money, it's relatively small concentrations of that as you go through history. By and large, most people have been poor for a long time.
Yeah.
um, so you have to imagine that a lot of this is, and we know, just from people who've talked about it, a lot of this is multi-generational kind of ideas.
Right.
You could call them plots in some instances. You could call them, liberations in others, and all of these, different ideas. But a lot of this stuff is inherited at this point. And I think, I don't think it's too much of a coincidence that we're seeing the same old playbooks being used. I don't think it's too much of a coincidence that, the people with all the resources are lacking original ideas. You can't see, when's the last time you saw an original movie? When's the last time that a new Tolkien came about, right? Uh, our artistic creativity has all been stifled by the pursuit of the almighty dollar,
Yeah.
and the people who control those dollars, they lack imagination, just because a lot of, like what we talked about before. If you didn't go through the struggles, if you don't go through the suffering, if you didn't see those perspectives, well, you didn't grow, you didn't understand those emotions, what it was to be human in that moment, and you're going to be so detached from these real ideas of where really I would argue that art is born and creativity is
Yeah.
born, that you're not going to go off and fund these creativity and art ideas. You're going to fund the thing that works, or the thing that we've always done, and then you end up in this quagmire, which I kind of see from, if you're looking at big media, mainstream media, all large, it is pretty much a quagmire of ideas. There's nothing novel really coming out. So
Yeah. It brings me back to our idea of symbols. And I heard a good quote that I wrote down that a word is a word is symbolic of meaning. However, it is rendered powerless without experience. And so many people today, if we look at multi-generational plans of people in positions of authority, people, maybe the person that started that family, or maybe the CEO of that company had the symbolic idea and the power behind that idea to make their family or company great. But when it's passed down to a child who didn't have to work for anything, they no longer have the ability or the respect of the community to make those ideas work. It's like a full scale Billy Madison only Billy doesn't get the company. You know what I mean? Like, it's this
Absolutely.
idea that you haven't earned it, and so it's going to die in your family. And you know what? The question is, like, if you had a company, or you built, say, a system that works unbelievable, and you get to a point in your life and you have your daughter versus some guy from a third world country, who are you going to give that idea to? Are you going to give it to your daughter, or are you going to give it to a guy in a third world country who's probably the best person to run it, but is not your blood and you don't trust him? You know, I'm not sure anybody can answer that question until they get there, but you know, what do you do?
Right. But I would think most people, if they were being honest, would say their daughter.
Yeah, I think so
You
too.
know, and that's, I think you could dissect that and you could figure out a good chunk of the evidence and reasons why that may be. But at the end of the day, it's it's the way that we structure these things. If, for instance, like healthcare for profit,
Okay.
how does that make sense from an ethical point of view? If
Okay.
if you know that profit is going to be the driver, eventually the drive for profit ignores all ethics.
Yep.
So eventually you're going to run into a place where the drive for profit outweighs the ethical boundaries of practicing medicine, and you end up with a very broken system and a very dangerous system. I would say we're pretty close to that right now in a lot of places in the world. Um, and news is another one. Should news be for profit? The same thing. If all of a sudden profit is the motivation, news ends up in a position where it's not about news, it's about making profit, and thereby the integrity of that dissipates. And we see this and I would say anything, that we deem as kind of like a pillar of society. To have these things as for-profit centers where, the idea behind it is that, somebody can come in with a better idea and take over the system. The reality being that you'll get bought out far, far before you ever get that opportunity. And the amount of money that you're up against is, makes, the mountains of work that everybody does look like molehills compared to the amount of effort it would take to overcome. Uh, you know, these these types of situations that we set ourselves up in they eventually, they will allow us to propel ourselves, but eventually we stagnate out. And I think we're seeing a lot of those stagnations right now. So I think the solution is really to just remove that for profit, or the start of a solution is to remove that for profit from these kind of pillars of society. Uh, you know, Even things like when you get down to it, like real estate, same type of idea. The fact that you have this real estate market where now there's probably not a major city in the United States where a working family of two from, you know, uh, even a moderate college education would afford to be able to a 30-year mortgage in some of these larger cities. It's just it's outside of their range of even thinking about it in some cases, right?
Yeah.
So where does that end up? If we keep running these things out, kicking the can down the road and keeping them unsustainable, and knowing that we have these roadblocks and things like healthcare and information and medias, and just allowing this massive redistribution of resources, uh, we don't have too much longer for it to work before something breaks at a dramatic level. And I think we're kind of already seeing those fractures become, very apparent, that of how detrimental they can be. If you were to rewind the world 15 years and ask if you ever thought that there would be a conflict between nation states ever again, everybody would look at you and be like, "Oh, no way. It's peaceful, man. Look at this world," right? Yet here we are, and World War III is threatening to break out more and more every single day that goes by.
Yeah. I would. I think you could definitely make the case that we're in World War III. We're in this world of, you know, trade war, currency war, world war. We've seen the trade war. We've seen the tanker ships just sat outside the docks. That's clearly a trade war. Currency war, like who's devaluing their money faster? You could argue that the billions of dollars we're sending to Ukraine is really just going to recapitalize banks in Europe. And the lines have been drawn. The only thing that hasn't been drawn is the first spot where the next Hiroshima is going to be.
That's an interesting argument. I can definitely see that perspective. Um, there's another one that I see as well, where you know I see this as the end of nation states.
Mm.
Um, if you think about it from who has the money and who's pulling the punches here, uh, we have for the first time, these multinational companies that operate pretty much, they can get around any tax, any regulation. They can act with autonomy throughout the world by, one loophole or another. And they're just more agile.
Yeah.
They have the ability to pivot. They have the ability to not have to deal with populist movements. We saw what, everybody wanted to do a union in Tesla or what it was, and he fired them all or something
Yeah.
like that. So they have a lot more capability to be much more agile in the world, and because of the amount of resources that they have, I think, and if you look at things like the World Economic Forum and what they talk about, I think you see that there is a concerted effort to remove the influence and power of nation states across the world, to bring it under the umbrella of, a one world government type idea. Because realistically, you could talk about it all you want, but how do you go from these nation states where everybody's taught, their Pledge of Allegiance from when they were the youngest babe, uh, to and have these mass militaries, to everybody singing "Kumbaya" around a fire? Well, the reality is you probably don't. But if you wanted to get even close, you couldn't have the people who were shouting their national anthem. So you'd have to dismantle that in some way, shape, or form. And I think there's an argument to be made that this is the dismantling of those nation states.
Yeah. That's a great argument to be made. And I read a book a while back called Connectography, and it was by Dr. Parag Khanna. And that's exactly what he was talking about, is the end of nation states and the development of city states. It would be
Mhm.
sort of like the Shenzhen model, or,
I would
I
call
hate.
them, yeah, I call them technocratic city states. Kind of how I think of them. Basically, instead of where you have Apple owns the baseball field, Apple owns San Francisco type idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And they already have it. I think that there's been, gosh, people should probably look this up, but I think that in Nevada somewhere, they're already trying, like that's what a smart city is, right? A smart city would be owned by Microsoft. They'd have their own police force, they'd have their own currency, they'd have their own military, they'd have their own data centers, and the people that would be employees are kind of like citizens. I mean, an employee at a company is like a citizen
Mhm.
of a country. You're subjected to their laws, their rules. It's
Mhm.
it's it's almost there. Like you said, they operate worldwide, and you could even extrapolate the whole, let's make everybody skeptical of government and get rid of and collapse the governments, and then we'll just step in and pick up the pieces.
Yeah, because everybody trusts Apple, right? You got one in your pocket.
Yeah.
So
That's so
and then and if you look, by and large, there is a massive erosion of trust in state.
yeah.
It's easy to make the argument that that's for a good cause. When you look at uh, just everything that's happened over the past 20 some years, I mean, the erosion of trust in government has just been a consistent downhill slide. Even back in the late 90s, you had some rumblings of this, but ever since, September 11th, it's really been, just a continual, one event after another, then all of a sudden a revelation about a scandal, and then another scandal, and then another scandal, and then another scandal that was covered up by these
Yeah.
10 people, and then another scandal. And then eventually it's to the point where it's like, well, if there's so many scandals, it must all be a scandal. And, that's a lot of people's takeaway.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, pretty soon you get a company dollar that you can only use for goods at the company store,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
That's pretty dark to think about. I
Well, and then, you'll still have, there's always been a free market. It was the barter system way
mm,
back in the day.
right.
And free markets just evolved because you have something that I don't have, and I have something that you don't have.
Yeah.
Your one goat looks pretty good for four chickens. Um, and so depending on where all of this fractures from a technological perspective, there's already systems out there that use different cryptocurrencies as peer-to-peer markets
Right.
that are essentially,
Right.
technical barter systems where, people would be selling a cow for a Bitcoin type idea. Now, I think that's a ways off, and you would have to have, kind of a really large fracturing of nation states. But I could easily see something like that developing because, even if there is a fraction of nation states, all these technocratic city states are all going to want that interconnectivity, that, that access, that internet, whatever, what have you. So I think that would be one of those things that would persist technologically.
Do you think that would make like it seems, you know, it seems it is the idea of nationalism that truly keeps, or the belief in our government that keeps people, this idea of potential fairness, or we the people to create a more perfect union, this idea that I think still permeates the American continent, is that we are one people. We do believe in this country. That's what stops an incredible revolt from happening. I think
Hmm.
there's a lot less belief in the corporate system. Like, you know, I know people where I work that thoroughly detest the management there and believe
Oh yeah.
them. You know, I'm not sure what would protect the corporate leaders from running the city from all out just death and destruction. People would want to murder those guys.
Well, I think, it comes down to, the idea is that a lot of these countries, in combined with the World Economic Forum, the IMF have said that they're going to have, these central bank digital currency. By 2025, the idea is to roll this out worldwide.
Mhm.
Now if all of a sudden you get people on this system, a cashless system, and this cashless system breaks, now what happens? The only thing that has value is
Mm,
the access to all of these systems for one, but then, just common goods and, things like that. So the tech companies, the companies who would be able to keep these things systems up and floating, they would be able to provide different qualities of life depending on, their smart city level. So you would have people who would be like an Apple, who would have their $1 trillion campus that would, and then Apple Town, where everything was, white and glossy, and the only way to get in there was be to have a certain amount of status, a certain amount of Apple coin, right? And
right.
so, and why wouldn't they? If you look at just the ideology of Apple people, they would love it if everybody around them was an Apple person, right?
They would, yeah.
Especially the more nerdy people about it and the more tribalistic people about it, so would Android people, and so would, people who, loved Linux. They would have their little breakaway mountain colonies, but the idea would be you would have to have some sort of central infrastructure to keep everything connected. And so the resources to do that, those companies have those resources now. Every nation state on this planet is up to their ears in debt from on
Yeah.
the books, if you look at it on the books. Whereas where's all the money? Where's all the resources? It's sitting in the bank accounts of Apples and Googles and
Yeah.
Teslas and SpaceX's and places and people like that.
it's fascinating to think about, because I could totally see, if you look at Davos, that seems
Mm.
to me like a bunch of just CEOs talking. You know what? We could rule the world so much better than these governments. We're so much smarter than them. We're so much better than, and we deserve it, because look who we are. But
Mhm.
I could just see it. I could see them putting this plan in motion, and they get to 2022, and it's just failing spectacularly. And they're like, yeah, maybe we don't want to, but they're already like, we got to do it. You just look at Sri Lanka and people burning down government homes, and it's like, you sure you want to be in charge? Are you sure about that? And it's fascinating to
Well,
think about. And I could see them throwing the government under the bus, like, yeah, it's the government's fault. It's all these guys, they did it, and the government's like, wait a minute, this isn't the deal we had. We thought we were working in this together, it's
oh, well,
in
but then
some
I
ways
mean,
it's spectacular.
you have to look at these guys. You look at the deals they've been cutting, right? I mean, businesses have been
Yep.
cutting deals with
Yeah.
governments that are pretty dang one-sided for the business. You
Yeah.
know, eh, and again, it goes back to the idea that that at the top of these businesses, you got maybe a boardroom at best, if not one guy who's able to just assert
Yeah.
authoritarian role.
Yep.
And so they can make decisions, they can act faster, they can, if all of a sudden Apple wanted to give, I'm really making fun of Apple here, but
Yeah.
if all of a sudden they wanted to give everybody $1,000 who was an Apple customer, they can do that. They don't have to go through this infrastructure of the IRS and all these other things and the amount of institutional cost and all of that. They just become a much more efficient operator at the end of the day, because that's what businesses were built to do, is to efficiently make money. And now, instead of just making money, it's making money, power, influence, data, accumulating resources. And as businesses, as data really, and as resources become basically the arbiter of power and control today, I think that's I think we're seeing that kind of almost a natural progression, if you will, towards that type of behavior, that sort of system.
Yeah. Do you think that you could make the case that, like, the Chinese model of state-run capitalism is very
Mhm.
similar to a business model, like of a
Oh yeah.
corporatism?
Oh, oh yeah, sure. It's just a corporation with a lot of subdivisions. That's all it is.
It's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah. It,
Um,
it makes
and
sense.
it
Yeah.
and it allows them a lot of fluidity, allows them a lot of growth opportunity, which we've seen. It also allows for a lot of carelessness.
Yeah.
Um, they don't broadcast it far and wide, but economically, they've been screwing the pooch for a long time. They've been lying and fudging the numbers for the past 20 years of this mass economic boom. So much so that you got, what was that one company? It was $300 billion or something asset fund that
Right.
couldn't afford to pay back its loans. And that's just like tip of the iceberg. Bad investment strategies. They have entire cities that were erected with zero people in them,
Yep.
that could hold 200,000 people. You have a laundry list of these things. So from an economic perspective, it allows you to cheat, and
Yeah.
they cheated. Now the thing about economics and free markets is typically, whenever you cheat, it comes home to roost in one way, shape, or form. Uh, by and large, the world I would still consider a free market, even though it's heavily manipulated by each one of the individual players that are playing at that level. But it's still a free market, and those things do eventually come home to roost. That's why like you see, kind of what happened to the Soviet Union and the breaking of that. You see, kind of essentially what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, and in the way that those resources are being utilized to put pressures and break down these massive systems of influence.
Let me ask you this one. Since we're talking about the Chinese model,
Mhm.
do you see any difference between the Chinese model of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Americans model of the IMF, where you go in, you give people loans they can't afford, and then you get the resources in return? Is it the same thing with the Chinese model?
I, I think there's an argument to be made there. It's refactored colonialism.
Yeah, it is.
Uh, you know, we've done that before. From multiple countries have done it, and now it's just more socially acceptable to go in and be like, oh, hey, we actually invested. You just couldn't pay for it.
Hmm,
Which shouldn't be more socially acceptable, but because it's not so overt, because you just can't capture it on a single shot of an image or even
right.
a video for that matter, then it kind of loses its effect. um, but it's the same process really. It's going in knowing that you're creating an unfair system that eventually you're going to win simply because it's unfair. I mean, but then again, people love to gamble,
Yeah.
and that's the same idea behind gambling in casinos, except the idea in those systems is that there is a potential for you to win. When you're talking colonialism or what the Belt and Road Initiative or the IMF, there's no way to win. It's not a gamble. It's just
Yeah.
simply a matter of time. It's a question of resources, and they have them all, and you have none.
Yeah, it's, if we look at it like that, if we see the pattern of colonialism and we see the idea that the guy with the most is like the house in Vegas, he's probably going to win, or it's just a matter of time. Can the same be said for the structure of society in the United States? Like the people on the bottom don't have a chance, and the people with all the resources have all the opportunity.
Well, like I would move away from the absolutist of all and
Right.
none.
Of course
Um,
you will. You wrote a book called No Absolutes.
but you know, it, there's an adage of, "Oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps,"
Yeah.
which once upon a time in this country, when as a single income family you could afford a house, a car, and a retirement, sure, that made a lot of sense because there was the opportunity, if a single individual worked hard, that they could achieve, pretty much the American dream, quote unquote. Uh, that hasn't been true for quite some time. Um, you know, there's places in this country that if you just so happen to be born into them, uh, the chances of you pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is, may as well be negative. If you factor in that early death as part of that equation. So there is a large socioeconomic problem that is, the crux of many of these issues. And when you don't have that ability just because of the location that you were born into, to have a roof over your head, have water, have communication, have access to the internet, have a school that doesn't try to indoctrinate you or classify you or forget about you, or any of the other travesties that we're seeing, unfortunately, more and more with public educations, um, especially in lower, socioeconomic places. Factoring in all of this stuff, all of these nuances of where and when and how, it gets to the point where the chance for me to succeed is so far removed from what I can see potentially as an individual, that this becomes a much more simple solution to my
Mm,
problem. As does, not continuing to grow as an individual. As is, if you start to see these things, it's like, well, gosh, I don't want to deal with that. I can't deal with that. I have bills to pay. I have people to feed. I have, all this stuff. And, you get these recursive loops, that these feedback loops that, we're seeing, again, this goes back to the amount of people who have a sixth grade education in this country. Was only, 52 some percent. 18% are illiterate.
mm.
Now, that's not to say that they're not functional in society. They can't pick up trades and things like this, and I'm sure that that's how they're getting by. But at the same time, for in the realm of looking at it as a potential opportunity, how many opportunities did they get versus the other person who grew up in the right neighborhood and had a decent education, a good upbringing, or even heck, had a full-time parent. You don't meet too many of those well-adjusted kids anymore, but there's a couple out there, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's a travesty that we really don't talk about the underlying problem. And it's nice to have an idea of how it would look if we solved it, but what are we doing to solve these things? I don't see much in the way of solving these things. And usually, when somebody comes out with a solution, it's tied to either a government subsidy, a grant, or venture capital money, which at the end of the day, all are subjected to somebody wants to make a profit eventually. And again, tying it back into when you have these profit as motivation for these pillars of society, these foundations of society, you run yourself into this problem consistently over and over again.
Yeah. It's it's quite a conundrum.
Mhm.
I'm inspired though. I'm inspired for multiple reasons. One is that I think the younger generation has had to see their parents walk such a tightrope that they themselves have learned to balance what's important. And
I would agree.
because the older generation is getting older, because there are so many cracks in the system, I think that presents a lot of opportunity. And those are the things that I see coming forward. I think that someone who's may only have one parent but has access to YouTube or
Oh,
can find something that they enjoy. Maybe they go to a school that
I didn't mean it
is,
that way, by the way.
no, I hear you.
Yeah.
I agree. I
I
I think
meant
that
those
was,
as
yeah.
separate things.
Yeah,
Even one parent, full time parent, well adjusted. Those were all supposed to be separate ideas. I didn't want those to run together.
yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
I think I'm
To
sorry.
no,
Go ahead. What
to
do you
what
got?
to what you're saying, I'm optimistic as well. Um,
Yes.
I because the reality is that all these kids are getting exposed to all of this craziness. And
Yeah.
typically, you don't know until you know, and once you know, yeah, you're seeing a lot of different decisions. You're seeing one of the statistics that came out of something was that most of the Generation Z aren't getting their driver's license till 18 or later, whereas Generation X, it was the day they turned 16 type idea. So and there's a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of it is the exposure to what the world is, how the world operates. When we were growing up, yeah, you could turn on the TV, but you couldn't go research things unless you wanted to go to the library and look through encyclopedias. And by the time you ingested a fraction of what you would get in a podcast like this, your eyes were already blurry and you couldn't even see straight anymore. Now all of a sudden you can be running and exercising and have a podcast, and you can be you driving your car on a commute and have a podcast, and then the exposure, the amount of information that everybody, but especially the younger generations, because they're just more inclined to interact with it, uh, is getting in contact with. I think we're seeing those changes kind of happen in real time, and it makes me optimistic too, because I you know at the end of the whole thing, I think you get what's left of it is a group of people who realize where we made mistakes, where what sort of pitfalls were befallen to us, and how to extract ourselves from those situations, how to build around them, or how or what not to build, in when we're talking like things like nuclear technology, instead of uranium based reactors, we can build thorium based reactors. So yeah, nobody's going to have nuclear weapons, but we still have nuclear power with a lot less of the nuclear waste. And these types of things could power millions of people and be very clean for the environment. but we won't get there in the climate of today. It's going to take that next generation of all of those people seeing, the pitfalls, and then also understanding that there is other solutions. Being exposed to new ideas and having conversations like this, and looking at those podcasts and wondering, what the heck's a thorium reactor? Why have I never heard of that one? uh you know those types of that type of information is, I think, what's makes me the most optimistic, is just the raw access to it.
Yeah, that's so awesome you said that. Like, I have a real world example. I'm staying here with my wife's parents, and her nephew came over, a young gentleman named Tyler, brilliant young kid. I think he's 19 or 20, hasn't quite got his driver's license yet.
Mhm.
However, he was talking to his dad. We were having a conversation in the living room, and his dad was telling him all these things, and he's like, "Dad, I don't believe any of that's true. In fact, I looked it up, and what you're saying is a lot of, you're just you're really blustering right now." It was like everything
Mm,
you just said about a young guy who's kind of withdrawn from the norms of a Gen Xer, but
mhm,
is super analytical and is like, hmm. When it came to authority, he's like, yeah, I don't think that's actually accurate. In fact, what you're saying is completely this, this, and this. And it's so beautiful the way you summed it up because I just noticed that. And mind you, I'm sitting next to him, and his cousin was in town from Singapore, and she was giving us an idea about Singapore and why some of the pitfalls but beauty of it. And this girl was
mhm.
14 years old, and she goes, in Singapore, we don't have a lot of homeless people because you need a license to become a beggar. To which I'm like, is it expensive to get a license to become a beggar? But
Hmm.
it's fascinating because everything we were talking about, I got to see firsthand in a living room conversation with a 14-year-old, a 19-year-old, a 50-year-old, and a 47-year-old. And
Mhm.
it played out right there. It is inspiring to see, and I am thankful for those kids coming up, and I do think they have a lot of opportunity, and I think that kids that age would really do well to listen to me and you talk more because, it's an awesome podcast. But at least they
Well,
have access to people like us giving us our opinions over 47 or, you know, 50 years, and they can condense it down into a bite-sized 2-hour chunk and take away from it what they will. But it is a greater resource. It's like a condensed, nutritious meal that you can get away some calories from. But
yeah,
I gotta tell you, this is a fascinating conversation. I really enjoy them, and I really hope that people can take away from our conversations what you and I both take away from it. I'm having a lot of fun, man. Thank you.
yeah, me too, man. uh yeah, it's been a wonderful conversation. I think if people just start to have these conversations on their own, just ask a couple questions. Well, why is it that way? I mean, we've gone down, probably, I don't know, easily 48 rabbit holes that should be able to inspire at least one or two questions that, we've barely scratched the surface on.
Yep.
uh but it's been fun painting the scene.
Yeah, it has been, and I f I find the deeper our conversations go, the more questions I end up having, and so it's an absolute pleasure, Benjamin. I really appreciate it. And again, people, the book's called No Absolutes, and if you want to have a jump off point to any one of these rabbit holes, all you gotta do is buy the book and check it out, and you'll come away with a better understanding of not only what we're talking about, but the way I think you'll be able to understand the framework from which we're operating. It's an awesome read, and it's fun to read. And if you go to Benjamin's website, which will be in the show notes below, you can check it out, and you can always ask us questions. And that's what we got for today. Is there anything else you want to leave anybody with, Benjamin?
I don't think so. I just hope everybody has a wonderful week. You as well, and enjoy the rest of your travels.
I will, my friend, and it's always a pleasure. And I look forward to talking to you next week at our regular time. And we'll do it again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for spending time with us, and we'll talk to you next week. All right, aloha. Let's see if I can do this again.